The recording started just after you tried to say bad words.
My phone was still on ringing on, and I'm like, oh no, that's not what I said though.
No, actually, you didn't even say a bad word. You said shoot.
Yeah, that's true.
But it was you did a good edit. I would have not. There's not enough brain power for me to actually have a filter that would have stopped that. It would just would have been a curse
You're,
word. So
I'm surprised you're still functioning. You're mentally drained
I
with
am,
all the
yeah.
work
I was
and the
drained. So
move.
Saturday, I was a zombie by the time Saturday night got around, and we all went out to dinner, and I was just kind of
Right.
like, I was just
Yeah, that
there.
was yeah. I was like, he's gonna drive back tomorrow, and
Yeah,
he's
no,
gonna be exhausted.
we did good. Made it back to Austin safely so that I literally, so nobody knows what the hell we're talking about. Um, I
Convention.
literally walked in the door. I hadn't gotten everything out of the truck. I walked in the door and I was immediately put to work.
No.
And then a little bit later, my mom was like, "Hey, why is your pickup door open?" And I was like, because I didn't get to unload everything. I walked in and immediately was like, go do this, go put this here, go do that. This needs to come over here, help me with this." And she's like, "Oh, sorry."
So for those of you who do not know, John was basically the organizer of the Texas Beekeepers Association annual convention in Galveston, and it was a huge amount of work. And he had gone through the entire first day of the convention, and he was mentally drained and physically exhausted.
Yeah.
And then he drives back another 4 hours almost to get home, and he gets grabbed for work because he's moving this week.
Yes. Yeah. So in the nice space-time continuum of how things go when you record, we are recording this episode in advance. We are physically packing the last remnants of everything at the moment, but by the time you hear this, John will no longer be a resident of the state of Texas.
And I'm so sad.
Yes. Yeah. Lots of hugs on Saturday.
I know.
So, but yeah, we're recording this one in advance. So technically in real world time, we just got finished with our commentary on last week's episode for the Beekeeper chat. We had our commentary on immunizations versus treatment for pests.
Mm-hmm.
And this week we are going to talk to everybody about bee-centric beekeeping.
That's right.
And yes, I do realize that I just dropped a bombshell out there, and I'm going to leave it, and we're just going to talk about other stuff, and I
That's
will
right.
explain the other stuff later.
And you managed to make me, yeah, I'm just kind of gonna, I'd like to change the subject because this is a really sad subject for me. So,
um,
okay.
So now on a flip side of that, Natalie and Les actually are taking over my main apiary and
Mm-hmm.
the, what was it, like 20 some odd hives that were out there at that
Yes.
location. So they are in very good hands.
It's a
And
great apiary, and we're thrilled to be continuing your good work out there.
yeah, I am super thrilled that they're going to be in good hands, and that's it's a great location. That's where my favorite honey has
Mhm.
ever come from out there, and they seem to do great and thrive. So definitely looking forward to hearing how that all goes. But
Mhm.
from a different perspective on beekeeping, the whole concept of bee-centric beekeeping and be mindful, and Natalie and Les and a lot of the things that they do are very much in line with bee-centric. And
Mhm.
then also a lot of stuff from Dr. Thomas Seeley is
Mhm.
in line with bee-centric. And what that in means, and like the highest level overview of the definition is, what is it that the bees themselves are specifically looking for? What is the closest thing to natural that the bees would actually seek out or do? That's kind of the high overarching bee centric concept. So if you look at Thomas Seeley and you look at when he was doing research on swarm traps, a lot of bee centric thinking has to go into that, because he was doing experiments to see how high versus how low they prefer a potential nest cavity to be, how
How big?
large or how small, the
Mhm.
opening size, the shape,
Mhm.
things along these lines, internal volume of the cavity, humidity and moisture, and air penetration and light penetration, like all these different things go into play with bee centric type concepts. And the whole point of it is being able to find out and understand what they prefer in nature and what makes the most sense for them in a natural environment, and then being able to turn around and apply that to your own beekeeping practices to try to keep the bees in a bee-centric manner that's going to be hopefully more healthy and natural to them than some of the crazy bizarre things that we as humans come up with that we think they should adapt to. um,
Mhm.
this is also the same concept as, and I've told this story many a times, but the whole concept of, well, I bought a flow hive and I've had it out there for 6 months and I still haven't had a single bee move in. What am I doing wrong?
No.
Or I've got bees. This is a favorite one for removals. I get this removals all the time. I've got bees that are living in this tree or they're living in this house. And I bought a Langstroth box and I'm going to set it right there in front of them. So they're going to just leave
They're
and
gonna
move into
walk
that,
in.
right?
Yep.
And I'm like, no, why would you think that? Well, it's a beehive. And I'm like, right, it's not a birdhouse. It's not like the bees didn't choose that. Man made that. Man chose that. And they're never going to give up a place that they have chosen that they
And they're
love
established.
because there's
Yeah.
very specific reasons they chose it and they're established. So best case scenario, they may send out a swarm and that reproductive split and swarm may choose to live in that container, but the bees that are still in the tree or the wall are still going to be in the tree or the wall. You're not solving anything. So yeah, so bee-centric can go into a lot of different concepts and ideas. And I thought that it would be kind of an interesting little conversation to have, especially with Natalie, who is very, very much into that concept of beekeeping. You know, I mean, be mindful. It's kind of all in the
Mm-hmm.
name.
That's
So
there's so many reasons we chose that name.
it works for so many things.
Yes, it does. So yeah, basically that's our passion. Absolutely our passion to work with the bees, and not working against them. To kind of the core of that is to really understand the superorganism and everything that happens in the hive. And before I forget, I wanted to mention there's a book that is super important if you want to become a better beekeeper, and by understanding better the superorganism, and the biology of the honeybee by Winston, to me is a
Yes.
bible for beekeeping, because it's not written from the perspective of beekeeping at
Right.
all.
It's
There's no
a
ulterior
perspective
motive.
about
That's
just
right.
bees and what the bees do and seek and need. And
And it's not looking at exploiting the animal. It's not looking at doing anything for ourselves, for pollination or anything. It's not looking to increase production of anything. It's just telling you this is what the bees do, and it does it in so many details, and such a educative way, that it's really making you understand what it is that makes the bees tick. And I think that once you understand how the bees work, both from practice, like it's super important to be in the beehives and to spend time with those bees and get a lot of time, frame time, like I call it, being able to go through a lot of colonies over time, and just kind of be able to observe for yourself and get your instinct about what it is that they do and why they do it. But if you read that book, I guarantee you that you're going to really jumpstart your learning and reinforce your practice with a whole lot more in-depth understanding of the bees and what they do, so that you can leverage that in turn, and really use what you know to inform how you keep your bees. What we always tell people is that you want to work with the bees, you want to dance with the bees, like Les says. And
yes,
if you try to impose your will and make them do things that they're not at the right time for, or they're not in the right mode for, or that's not good for them, you will fail more often than you will succeed, for sure.
yeah, you're
Right? You
setting
cannot.
yourself up for failure. You're setting them up
Mhm.
for failure. It's
Yeah,
the concept of swimming upstream or going
against
against the
the
grain.
current. That's
you're
right.
you're it's going to be a constant battle, an uphill challenge the entire time. But
Hmm.
if you learn their natural ebb and flow and you work with their natural ebb and flow,
Hmm.
everything goes so much easier and smoother,
Hmm.
because you can see, or you know, like at this point in time, based on the signals and the signs that the colony is giving me, I now know that they need XYZ, and this is the perfect time to do it. If you're
Hmm.
trying to get them to draw out more comb or expand and grow, but it's the wrong time of the season, they don't have enough young bees, they don't have enough sugar, like no matter what you do, it's never going to equate to they're going to draw out more wax, because it's
Right.
just not the natural time for them to do that. So that's
Hmm.
one very good aspect of it.
And if you try to rear queens when there's no nectar flow, you're really, really swimming
Or
against
when
the
there's
current.
no drones. That's
And when there's no
another,
drones.
yeah, that's another thing too. When people are like, oh, well, you know, you can just raise queens earlier. Well, yes, you can. They can raise queens at any point in time during the year. It is physically possible. But if those queens don't have any drones to go mate with, it's pointless.
So what you have to be careful of is that you get a lot of information out there. A lot of it is on Facebook, YouTube, all those people that are actually getting their information from commercial beekeepers that are doing things for a different purpose.
Yes.
They're actually, they have goals that are completely different from that of backyard beekeepers. They cannot afford to do things the way backyard beekeepers can. And one of the examples I like to talk about, excuse me, is feeding pollen, and especially those soft sugar bricks at a time that is not meant for the bees. It's never a good time to force them to rear brood.
Right.
Basically, the bees should follow the webs of the ebbs and flows of local cycles of weather and forage, because that's how they can better plan ahead and better answer the needs that they have themselves, right? If we're throwing their pollen thinking we're going to give them better nutrition, we're actually forcing the queen to rear more brood at a time when it might not be a good thing. My favorite example is if you're doing it early in the spring for the purpose of getting a whole lot of bees before the nectar flow hits, so you get more honey production, or in the case of commercial beekeepers, so that you can go take them to pollination
Pollination
contracts at a
services. Yeah.
time that's way earlier in the season that the bees would naturally kind of expand. um, when the commercial beekeepers do it, they do it for a reason. They have a specific goal, they have a specific process that they go through,
Yeah.
and it kind
You know
of
what it looks like?
Mhm.
It's typically green. It's kind of shaped like an S, and it's got a couple of lines that go down through it. I think they call it a
Yes.
dollar sign.
Well, I'm
Um,
trying to not be as critical about commercial beekeeping because it has some purpose for us to
oh,
eat, and
it totally
it's some,
does.
yeah,
But you
but
still
it
have
is,
to acknowledge the fact that it is
it
driven
absolutely
by
is.
profit. It is a business, and
Mhm.
it follows the business's calendar and schedule and the
Right.
demand of the population of humans,
Absolutely. Mhm.
not necessarily the natural cycle of the bees themselves that
And
are
that's why
in the
they
middle
run
of all
into
this.
problems, right? Because the bees get sick, they get disease. There's all kinds of things that happen. There's a lot of winter losses. The backyard beekeepers, some of them, especially as they grow a little bit bigger, they also probably want to maximize their honey production, potentially sell it, potentially sell bees, so that they can at least pay for their addiction, which is my case. But I
Depending
think
on
that
how addicted you are,
I'm
it
very
still
addicted. I'm a
takes
bee hoarder.
a lot more and more and more to continue paying for that
Mhm.
addiction.
Not if you do it right and you get to keep your bees alive,
That's
right?
true.
So
If you're not
and if
replacing 40 to 50% of them every year because they died,
that's
and yeah,
right. And if you are doing it in a way that you're not exploiting the bees as widgets, the colonies as widgets that are there to make you profit,
just
it's not,
a cog in the
yeah, a
wheel of a
cog
big
in the
machine.
wheel.
Yeah.
But if you do it in a way that you're leveraging more the knowledge that you have and the services that you can offer, you're not exploiting them as much. You're still being successful. You can still make, actually, I think, a lot more money without as much effort. It's a huge amount of work to be a commercial beekeeper,
It
right?
is. It absolutely
So
is.
I
And
totally
it's a
respect that.
lot of there's a lot of costs that go into it too that outside of the commercial aspect would not be associated with beekeeping.
That's
But
right.
when you put on, I'm traveling across multiple states, now you've got intra and interstate permits. You've
Right.
got the fuel to get them there. You've got the time for the driver to get there. You have
Mhm.
room and board and food for the driver to get there. And that's none of that would be in a normal beekeeping situation where your bees are not being carted
No.
around and moved around. So
Right.
they have to then compensate for all of that by having
Yeah.
insane amounts of colonies to be able
I,
to get payback on those contracts and be able to cover them. So that's a huge
I'm
thing.
in awe of the amount of work that the commercial beekeepers do. It's an insane amount of work. It's hard work. And it's, I mean, I totally respect that because, I mean, kudos, chapeau, like we say, I tip my
Hats
hat
off.
off to
Yeah.
them because I wouldn't want to do that. That's
Yeah.
too much work. I cannot do that kind of work. It's super hard and it's very risky financially as well, right?
So
So
let's
I was
look
gonna
at oh go ahead. Go ahead. If
I
you
was
have
going to
another
finish
point there.
my thought. The if you feed soft sugar bricks or pollen, that way you're force feeding them the pollen because they're looking for the carbohydrates. they eat that, they get broody. First, your queen doesn't get any break. There's not brood breaks because you don't want the brood break. You want more and more bees, and that means that actually increases your chances of having mite infestations, because with the brood break comes a sanitary cycle of cleaning off all the mites from the capped cells, and also you can run the risk of having that brood up at a time that's highly uh, not good for the bees. For example, if it's early in the spring, you can run into a problem of them swarming prematurely. And
Yep.
then you've got your mated queen that leaves, and they're rearing another queen, a virgin queen, at a time when there's the least amount
There's
of possible of
yeah,
drones,
if any.
if any. You can also increases your load of pests. I talked about the mites, but there's also potentially some issues with small hive beetles, because there's some of that pollen patties or whatever that you get in there.
Yeah, and the
You
small hive beetles will overwinter with your colony, so they're
They
already
will.
in there.
And
They've stayed nice and toasty with the cluster all winter.
yeah, and when they get the cluster gets contracted, they have a little bit more leeway to get to those unprotected resources as well. So there's something to keep in mind. But the other aspect of things, and I'm losing my track of
Well, so
thoughts.
so your whole concept there is like, what in this first aspect, what you're circumventing in the natural ebb and flow of it is the rest cycle and the rest period. The colony
Yes.
has evolved to contract and
Hmm.
condense down
Hmm.
and go through this period of rest because it has worked so hard over those spring months and then again in the fall to prepare
Hmm.
for winter. They're supposed to have a break and they're supposed to go through and kind of calm down,
Cleansing. Hmm.
but they're also following the natural flow of the environment around them. There is
Hmm.
no food out there and there's no point for them to be out there. So they have also, cut back on all their energy expenses that they would be doing.
Hmm.
Now, if you start feeding them pollen and you start feeding them sugar, they don't necessarily understand that there's no food outside of their house, but
Hmm.
you've given them this incoming food source. They start building up, they start brooding up, they start rearing all these mouths that have to be fed. And if you slack off on that, once you start,
They
there's still
starve.
nothing growing and they're going to starve to death very quickly because
I'm not laughing.
all those babies, they have to eat and they have to they have to do it. And if they can't, now everything goes to just literally hell in a handbasket.
Well, they're
You end
trying to
up
keep them warm in
right.
the spring, right?
Yeah,
A cold spell,
exactly.
and there's you got chill bird everywhere, right?
Well, the other part too that a lot of people don't understand for us down here, one of the reasons that like that winter storm was so detrimental to us, but it didn't affect beehives in places like Chicago, for instance. Every year we made a joke in the very first season of the show, Chicago, we changed its name to Chiberia.
Barbaria.
So you end up with these situations where they're always cold. It's always bitter cold out there, and they've been left with all the food they need for the entire year. Those bees are not even thinking about brooding up, and the
Mhm,
temperature really didn't change. So it didn't impact them because they stayed in
mhm,
their cluster and they kept doing what they were doing. But for us, that's not the case. We
mhm,
start having these warmer periods in January. We can have random days up at 80 degrees, and the bees, if you start feeding them, they're like, woohoo, spring's here. The
mhm,
sun's out. It's warm. It's beautiful. There's sugar coming from somewhere. There's
mhm,
this pollen that they're bringing down here to us. And they start brooding up. And then all of a sudden, middle to late February hits. We drop back down into the 20s. There was
mhm,
no actual food available for them. They've got 3 times the population that they should have had at that point, and they
mhm,
all need fed, plus all the babies. And then you end up, like you said, worst case scenario, chill brood, lots of those babies die,
mhm.
or they all die because they either starve or freeze or a combination of the two.
So there's always unintended consequences and prices to pay when it comes to this. But mostly what I want people to remember is that whenever you try to impose your will and your own agenda on the bees, if you do it without taking into account the way the bees work and the superorganism works, then you end up having trouble, because that's going to not work out the way you want to. There's ways where you can, just by understanding and being able to read the behavior of the bees, by taking into account what's happening around in the environment, where you are in the cycle, and how, what kind of bees you're keeping, the genetics, and all this, and how they've been doing before. You can still leverage that, if you understand all this properly, to actually turn profits, if that's what you're looking for, or maximize your honey production, if that's what you're looking for. But by doing it and understanding the superorganism and how it works, then you can do it in a way that's sustainable, and that's actually going to be long term much more beneficial to you even, because your bees are going to be healthier, they're going to live longer, they're going to produce more in the end. And so I always say less is more. Get
Right.
it?
Yeah.
Less
Less
crowder.
crowder. Yeah. So one of the other things about bee-centric beekeeping and keeping things in mind for the bees. So I often say, like, a Langstroth beehive is still a man-made hive. And
Mhm.
really, the only consideration that was given to the bees in a Langstroth colony is the concept of bee
Bee
space. And
space.
that's it. The rest
Mhm.
of it was for man to make it easier on us to be able to
Mhm.
harvest without killing the colony, saving the resources of the comb and being able to reuse it and put it back into place.
That's right.
But the only thing for the bees was the bee space. Now,
No,
from a
I was gonna
bee,
say some can argue that it's also the shape of the vertical trunk of the colony
of
and all
like a
that stuff.
tree, that is
I
true, but we do it backwards though.
Well, and I would say that in from what I've heard from my friends, and you can maybe confirm or infirm, is the majority of the choices that the bees make is for horizontal configuration
A lot
instead
of
of
times,
vertical.
yeah, a lot of times they start off and they grow, and that's something that I've actually talked about a lot too. Is people will say, oh, but the colonies grow, they say they grow up because that's what they think they do because they keep putting boxes on top of them, but
They
you're
don't grow up
invalidating their bee
ever.
space. So they
Hmm.
go up in there to be like, what the hell? And they try to fix it. But in reality, they start at the top of a cavity.
Hmm.
The very first comb is built, and that comb goes down and
Down.
out until
Hmm.
it reaches the containment field that it's in. The
Hmm.
next comb goes over beside it. They will continue to expand outward
Hmm.
until they hit a barrier, just like they continue to grow the combs downward until they
Right.
hit a barrier.
That's
So
right.
they will expand long ways, and they're in fallen logs and trees. They're in the sides of houses. There's lots of
Naturally.
different scenarios where they run long ways in
Hmm.
nature that they chose on their own accord versus in the natural chimney type shape of stuff. And you can say, yes, it is truly designed to mimic that. But in reality, we're
It's not.
still invalidating it
Yeah.
because the wood that they're in is barely 3/4 of an inch thick. It's
Hmm.
not the same thing as a minimum 3 to 4 inch thickness of a tree trunk that's going to provide way more insulative value to them.
Hmm.
And in the tree, nobody's adding extra space above them. They've started at the
That's right.
top of that
Bingo.
cavity and they're just building down. So if you wanted to build a true Warray type style hive that was made out of thick lumber and actually had a crane and a winch to pick that sucker up,
Yeah.
you could put boxes below it doing the nadiring or under supering.
Hmm.
That would be the closest to mimicking a quote unquote tree in nature.
Right.
But one of the things that is very, very beneficial, you can do it in the Langstroth, but it's naturally done in a top bar or even in a Warray because there
Yes.
is no foundation, is
Hmm.
natural comb building and natural cell size of their choosing and their placement
Right.
because they know I need this many drone cells. I need this many this, and I need them located in these positions. And a Langstroth or any type of frame that has a pre-printed foundation is
Thank you.
forcing them into a cell size that we have chosen, not that the bees have chosen. And they've manipulated that cell size for various purposes, again, that had nothing
Yep.
to do with the bees. It was man thinking,
To
well,
maximize honey
if
production.
1 + 1 = 2, then 2 +
Mhm.
12 = 90. You know, they make these huge leaps in thought and stuff. But natural cell size, that consideration is another part of bee-centric beekeeping, going through and making sure that the bees are choosing the sizes that they need. And Les has talked many times about how, there isn't actually one consistent size. You'll find some bigger cells in other places and
That's
smaller cells where seams are, where they fused it together. And watching the bees also build a comb is fascinating because sometimes they'll start two separate combs. This one will be
three,
drone comb.
four,
This one will
four
be
lobes.
worker.
Yeah. Hmm.
They'll grow them and then they'll fuse them together into a perfect solid comb that you would have never known started as two or
Hmm.
three or four little pieces. And then, as you look through there and you get better at your beekeeping, you can identify where these seams are and, oh, this is all drone brood and this is all worker brood cells. But people they need the drones. But at the same time, if you're freaking out because you're like, oh, but I got all this drone comb, we should get rid of that. Drone comb holds way more than
More
worker
honey.
cells.
Yes.
So, yeah, they're going to use it to raise boys, but they need those boys. They serve a purpose for the function for the
Hmm.
colony. A healthy colony has them. And then once they're done, they are obviously more than capable of saying, we don't need you anymore. And they get rid of the
Take
boys.
them out.
And then all that turns into storage space, and they
Mhm.
will utilize it for what they need when they need it to. So that is another big consideration on Bee-Centric: natural cell and natural comb building by the bees themselves.
Right. And I would go even further than the natural cell sizes being smaller, much smaller than that 5.4 millimeter that you find on the foundation. And even in the small cell, the bees tend to build those much smaller. What that does is that their developmental cycles are shorter. They are sometimes emerging from their cap cells within 1 or 2 days from they would otherwise on foundation. And what that does is that it really greatly reduces the amount of time available for the mite foundress to make viable offspring, mated females that would come out with her.
Yep.
So instead of having 3 or 4 that come out with her, you
You
got
might just have
one
two.
and a
Yeah.
half, and that's it, right?
Yep.
So 1.5 doesn't count, right? So, but you might have 2 in some cases, right?
I
and
love
so
that. That's like the national averages of families.
yes.
2 adults and 1.5 kids. I'm like, oh my God, what happened to the other half of that
Yeah,
kid?
cut in half. So that's something that's been proven, and that's where that knowledge that I was talking about earlier is important as well. With that book, you can kind of tell some of these cycles and things. But the other thing I would say about foundation is that it really it brings in structural rigidity, and therefore the vibrations that they use to communicate between each other are greatly muffled. So we don't think about that because we don't care, because all we care about is the honey. But in the end, it's really, I think, harming the colony because their communication messages are not as efficient. They're not as able to tell each other where the food is and what's going on in the colony. And we're dampening those communication pathways when we're using something that's rigid within the wax. Yes, it makes it a lot easier for the beekeeper to manipulate carelessly the frames and to put them in extractors. However, it's not it's counter to what the bees do, but it's also probably harming the way they conduct business.
Yeah.
So there's that to be
Some
taken into account as well.
some definite good, like all of that just came from one simple concept.
Mhm.
And say you are a Langstroth beekeeper and you do have foundations in your frames
Mhm.
and you want to try to see what this is like. Otherwise, pop the foundation out.
That's
Just
right.
pop it out of there. They will build the comb. You will be amazed. It'll look like it's got foundation in it. They'll build it within the confines of that
A
actual
lot
wooden
faster.
frame. They'll
Mhm.
hook it together. And yes, faster, because in nature, they build it. You can't see me if you're just listening to this, but I'm making funny gestures in the video. They build it actually both sides at the same time because it's
Yeah.
got a very sharp seam, and they're
Mhm.
always pulling and drawing from that seam. So they're building both sides of it at the same time, not one side and then the other, so they
Yes.
can work together and actually have this collaborative effort to go through and get this all accomplished.
It
Um,
disrupts their processes
yes.
greatly.
Yeah. And so do the different sizes of frames too,
Mhm.
because they get started and then they've got to stop and they've got to move to this other one. They got to start again. So there's
Mhm.
lots of coordination and road bumps in there that kind of get messed up. But so that's one way that you can try that yourself if you want to. And if you've still got the frame, the only thing you need to be mindful of is the fact
Yeah.
that now you don't have a foundation in there. You could potentially run wire in it if you planned on extracting it out and you
I
didn't want it
cannot
to blow
stand
apart.
wires.
I can't either. I end up cutting them and ripping them out of there.
Yeah.
But just keep in mind, you've got something that is not as sturdy as what you've been used to with a solid core
Mhm.
foundation to it. So be careful tilting it and leaning it and things like that. And you can do it in an extractor, but you need to start off slower and you need to
Exactly.
gradually increase that speed and
Mhm.
don't get too carried away.
Right.
Maybe you let the extractor run for 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes on 100%, you
Mhm.
know. Um,
Or you can do cut comb, which, by the way, is a
that's
lot. It's
awesome.
twice as expensive when you buy it as you would buy honey. We
And
were
it's
just
less
talking
work.
about earlier. There's one lady in Texas, and that's probably going to be me soon. But anyway, there's one lady in Texas. She sells a Ross round of comb honey for $45.
Yeah,
So if you're in it
I
for the money,
about fell over when I heard that.
and
But
she sells out every time. So there
yeah,
you go. If you're looking for money, cut comb is the way, or Ross combs or whatever. Comb
well,
honey
well,
is
and
king.
let's think about the concept of that too, though. This is derailed from
Oh
Bee-Centric
yes,
aspect
yeah,
of it,
because
but
it's not.
if you have a frame and it's in a top box, and they just drew out that comb this year. It's beautiful white virgin wax. The queen has never went up there and laid in it.
Hmm.
And you can take that, and one of the ways you can cheat, by the way, is you pick up that frame and hold it up to the sun. And if everything is a uniform color and the light is shining through it, then they
There's
haven't ever
never
done
been
anything to it.
pupae.
But if you can see dark sections in there and everything else is light, they have had brood in those sections, and you might want to omit that part, mainly because when they go through and they do the pupation cycle and they emerge out, that chrysalis and cocoon is still in there, and then they propolize and wax over it, and it makes it a little bit chewier and tougher, and it's just not the taste sensory aspect of it, you know. So you go through and you have this comb up there. If you were going to extract it, you got to go through the process of uncapping it, and you got to put it into the extractor. You got to spin it. You have to then clean the extractor. Then it goes into the settling tank, and you have to skim off the top, and you got to open it up and fill up your jars, blah, 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 blah. Or you just take it and you lay it down and you very gently cut it with a very sharp knife. You let it
board.
Yeah, you let the cells that you opened up finish draining off. Take it and put it into a container and sell it, and you're done. You didn't have to do any of the other stuff. You clean up a cutting board, not an extractor, not all this other stuff. So it's less work, it's less time consuming, it's less mess, and it's more money and more profitable.
Exactly.
Both because you're making more money and you're saving time on your own.
So I would say work smart, not hard. It's kind of what I always like to tell my students.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Keep it simple.
So
you want to work smart.
So that's the kind of the concept with the cell size. Let's see. One of the other things is like entrance sizes. So in nature, the bees purposefully choose entrances that are smaller because they are easier to guard. Now, there are many, many, many instances, and yes, I do removals all the time, so I can come up with just as many counters to this as all the rest of you. But yeah, they'll move into an owl box and the stupid opening is like 6 inches across, or they'll move into the hollow. Yeah, they'll move into the hollow of a tree and it'll be giant. Why did they do that? Because out of all of the options, that was the best one. That doesn't mean it was perfect. It means all the other ones were worse than that. So they chose that one, and then they fixed it. And how did they fix it? Like you just said, propolis and wax. And they create this giant leathery covering across the front. And guess what they leave open? 3 or 4 teeny tiny little holes that are literally just big enough for one bee to come and go out of that hole at a time. That's how they reduce that down to a smaller size that they would prefer. Keep out the water, keep out the light, keep out the airflow, and they can control everything better. So keeping that in mind, if you looked at a Langstroth colony, the entire front of that sucker is open. Now, yes, they do come with entrance reducers, and yes, you should use them, but you also hear lots of things about how, oh, but when the nectar flows really high, you need to remove that so that they can get in and out, and they need that airflow in there. No, they don't.
No.
When I started building top bar hives, I gave them 2 entrances, one in the, like, if you're looking at the long side of the hive, I had one in the front lower left corner, one directly in the middle. Those were their 2 entrances. And then on the back, I gave them 2 smaller vents that were screened off, one above and directly opposite the entrance in the middle, and then one above and opposite of the other entrance on the right-hand side. And you know what they would do? They propolize them closed. They closed them all off every time, to the point I stopped building them that way, because there was no point in me spending the time of boring this hole in there and trying to get it all nice and smooth and putting the screen on it if they're just going to propolize over it and leave it. They didn't need that ventilation. They didn't want it. So they fixed it, just like they do those tree cavities. So following the bees, and also that's a great example right there. I learned by following the bees. I saw how they were modifying my design, and then I modified my design to fit what they were trying to correct.
Pay attention, because what you're doing, if you're not paying attention, you're giving yourself a lot more work, but you're also giving the bees a lot more work that they could be doing something else with their time.
Those resources are valuable. They could be using that on something else. They could use their time on something else, like making honey, raising brood, you know, whatever it might be. They don't have to focus on fixing your flubs because of the brilliant ideas of how we thought it should be.
I would go even further and would say that being bee-centric is also being a little bit more humble about the whole thing, right? We think we know better than the bees. We think that we can help them by doing things that make sense to us, when it's a superorganism that doesn't function like we do. There's not, you know, they're not humans. They're not looking for air conditioning. They're not hot when it's hot outside necessarily. They're not necessarily cold when it's cold outside. You don't have to put like a whole blanket around or whatever. In some cases, when it's extreme, maybe you can help them out and you can keep bees in areas that you would not be able to keep them in otherwise. And
Right.
that's how usually that happens.
But
But
also
if
on like that blanket aspect,
Mhm,
why are you doing that?
yeah,
Because you put them in something they would have never lived in to begin
that's
with that was
exactly
way
right.
thinner than the things they would
Hmm.
have chosen on their own. And therefore, it needs the extra insulative value because
That's
of
right.
your design flaws, not because the bees need it
Exactly.
evolutionarily.
It's a combination of putting bees where they shouldn't be and having boxes that are not adapted to the way they do things. And it's basically exposing them to the elements. So those are the things that we look at when we talk about bee-centric, with the being a little bit more humble and not as, uh, just kind of learn from the bees. And if
Right.
you're observant and if you pay attention, they're going to show you what works for them. And you're going to have much less work to do because of it,
Right.
right?
Just
You're not going
follow
to be
their
fighting
guidance,
them. Mhm.
emulate them instead of
Yes,
trying to herd them into the direction you want them to
that's
go.
right.
So on the concept of like, the bees know best kind of thing
Mhm.
and being humble, do you
Bees know
realize?
best, I would say. I would say just be careful with that because sometimes they end up putting themselves in situations
Oh
that
yeah,
are not the best for them.
they're
But
not, they're
that's
just like people.
something
They're not
else. Yes.
infallible.
Yeah,
They
yeah, yeah.
do make some questionable decisions. Like for
Absolutely.
instance, if you wanted to put logic into it, you remove bees from a house, or you like they're up in the ceiling where they've made the comb and it gets too hot and there's evidence that every year the comb melts
The
and
comb
falls,
melts. Yes.
but yet another colony still moves in there and
Yeah.
tries to repopulate it because it smells like bees and has the pheromones.
Yeah.
The logical thought process that's missing there is, well, it may have that, but why aren't they still there? If it was a
That's
great
right.
place, why
Exactly.
aren't they still there? So they
Mhm.
are missing some little logical things there, but
They're not
to their
perfect.
to their benefit and to their credit though, they know down to a molecular level, I am short in this specific amino acid, this
Mhm.
one amino acid. And they can then communicate that with their foragers and have their foragers go out and seek out sources that are rich in that one amino acid.
Right.
I cannot do that. I cannot pretend to do that.
They're
I have no
fascinating.
idea. They do. That's one of the
Mhm.
reasons also why natural pollen's always better. And usually if you do
Absolutely.
a pollen substitute type thing, it's it is a bunch of protein things that are trying to emulate the natural pollen, but
Mhm.
it does not contain the natural enzymes and the other things, the prebiotics, probiotics that would be found on that living flower
Been on the
pollen.
phone.
So you're missing that right off the bat, but it is also a consistent level of things. Whereas the stuff they get out of nature is a varying level of things and they can
Exactly.
tweak it to what they need and what they desire. And I can't do that. You can't
There's
do
even
that. Most
no,
people
I
can't.
can't.
The scientists can't even do that because they're still reformulating all their stuff.
Well,
So,
and there's evidence that those man-made supplements are actually detrimental to the colonies. And
right.
and so if you're going to do any kind of pollen supplementation, keeping in mind that you might be throwing them off in their cycles, you should, I think, use natural pollen.
Yeah. If
That
you can
mhm,
harvest it, freeze dry it or freeze it, store it, and then when they need it, feed the real thing back to them
that's
is
right.
far, far better than, you know, any man-made thing that we do that's going to be lacking in
Right,
all this other stuff. So
right.
that's kind of true all the way across the board. But those
So,
are,
but I interrupted you earlier. You were going to say something that sounded like it was super important. Do you
it
remember what it
probably
was?
was like freaking revolutionary,
I
like answers
know.
to the universe. And um yeah, I don't know. It had to do like it kind of went in line with where I ended up going anyway with
Okay.
some of that. Oh, actually it was the pollen. It was the pollen part at the end.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Because that's what I was going to get back to, is that yeah, they're not necessarily as intuitive, as intelligent as we are, but for an insect in certain areas, they're far more intelligent than we are
Mhm.
because they have a more refined set of receptors to view the world with. They can break those things down to that molecular level. They can
Mhm.
identify different substances that we can't. We just
Mhm.
know if I eat this piece of broccoli, it's got good stuff in it and it's supposed to be good for me.
Right.
But well, okay, I will take that back, not from a conscious level, but there are instances of people that have been like on shipwrecks and they're out on life rafts and things like that. And they start going into starvation they
Mhm.
start having cravings that they cannot identify for really bizarre things. And there was some stories about, actually, I think it was one of the books that we actually had to read in school when I was like in middle school, about
Mhm.
how this one gentleman like caught the fish, but the only thing he would do is he was eating their eyes, and it was not anything that he would have ever done normally, and he wasn't like drawn to want to eat the rest. He was eating their eyes,
He
and
was
come to
finding
find
something there
out,
he needed.
his body was desperately deficient in a specific thing that was only found in that fish's eyes, but he
Mm,
didn't know that. He was just following the instincts of his body saying, I need something, and that looks like it's got what I need.
right.
But the bees can actually go through and they can identify these things, and they do it knowingly, and they communicate it with their sisters and send them out to go find these things
Yeah.
at the times that they actually need them. When you force feed them something and you give
Mhm.
them like a pollen patty inside their colony, there's a few different things to this, and this kind of goes back. We've got a bonus episode that will be coming out here eventually. It's one of the older ones, but most people on the main segments haven't got to hear it. But it's the one, I think, titled Going Bananas, and it talked about like a year ago, the people that were putting bananas inside their hives because, oh, the potassium and all this other stuff, and it helps with chalk brood, and it helps with blah 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 blah. And there's lots of arguments that go into the fact with, well, if your hive is hygienic and you put something in there that's a foreign substance that they don't
Mhm.
want, it's going to kick
They
that
will
hygienic
take it
behavior
from
into
you.
overload. They're going to clean it out, but at the process, they're going to scour the whole hive and clean everything else out, which probably is why the chalk brood got cleaned out of there.
Right.
But the banana at the same time is the same concept as your pollen patty. You put it in there, and
Mhm.
then it's, say
There's
you're
sugar in
lucky enough
there.
that it's gone later, but do you honestly know that they really consumed it, or did they just break it apart, carry it out the hive, and fly off with it and drop it on the ground because it ain't supposed to be
Yeah.
in there, you know?
Well, and you might empirically think that they've got more brood production or whatever, but what are the unintended consequences again of them absorbing a foreign substance that they do not forage on naturally?
Right. It could
Right.
be deficient in very specific things, that your colony is different than the next colony beside it, and it's way
Mhm.
different than the colony that your friend has down the road, just like we're different from each other and the needs of our bodies and things like that. And at different points in times, we all need different things for different reasons, and the colony is the same way. So be centric, like, if it comes to pollen, the only time I will feed it is in a powdered substance that
Mhm.
is external from the hives, because then if they deem that there is something in there they need and they want to go
They
forage for it and
choose
get it,
to do that.
they can
Yes.
do it. But I'm not forcing it into their colony. If it goes in there, it's because they chose to take it in there. Because again, just like searching for that hive, it was the best scenario out of all the options they found at that
Right.
time. And so therefore they took it. And trust me, when they don't need it, they won't
They
touch
won't
it.
even take it. And then also, to be pragmatic, you're doing things. You're using bees for, I'm sorry, ag valuations. You're doing some things with the bees. You're maybe potentially selling some of the bees. So you actually, there's a little bit, you kind of tap dancing that line where you kind of give them a nudge,
Right.
so that they can
I've
produce a little bit stuff
pre-sold,
for you. Right.
like hypothetically X amount of nukes this year,
Yeah.
and therefore I need to do X amount of splits. But to do that, the colonies need to be strong. So I've got to manipulate them. But what is
So
that
that's
bottom
why.
line that we're
Right.
working towards is a dollar sign, not
Again, right.
the bee-centric aspect of what
Right.
the bees needed. I was manipulating them to accomplish something I needed.
The bees don't need us to feed them. They
Nope.
really don't. They were there hundreds of millions of years, 100 million years ago, before we were there. They will be there way longer than we will be if we don't manage to poison them to death,
And
and
ourselves in the process.
and ourselves in the process. And but they do not human beings to help them by feeding them. They
Right.
are perfectly capable, and it's much better for them if they feed themselves. And again, with the carrying capacity that had that we talked about
The
last time,
intensity. Yeah.
yeah, we if we have colonies that don't have enough food, that are obviously malnourished or are not doing well, that's because there's not enough forage in the area. So if
Right.
you're being bee centric, you just kind of reduce them, you let them reduce those numbers down. There's
Right.
no need to be feeding them so that you can have more colonies. That's not bee centric, that's for you.
Right.
Right.
So intensity in colonies in an area in bee-centric, that's also a great another little side point. So on the back part of my main apiary, you notice there's over 50 yards
Hmm.
between most of the colonies. You
Yes.
might have one or two colonies side by side, and sometimes that arises from the fact that there's one legitimate colony and then one swarm box, and then eventually
Mhm.
somebody moves into it, and I just haven't moved them.
It's there.
But
Yeah.
you've got the colony, and then like 50 plus yards down the line, you've got another colony, and then another 50 plus yards, you got another colony, because in nature, colonies purposefully disperse themselves out and they don't choose places that are overly populated when they have the options,
Hmm.
because it's better for them. There's less competition for forage, those
Hmm.
natural resources. And it's better also from the standpoint of diseases, because you
Hmm.
don't have drift. You don't have bees accidentally going into the wrong colony that's right beside it. When that happens, they then carry parasites with them, like the mites. If they have a horrible disease like American foul brood, they carry that with them into that colony. So by having them further spread out to where that bee
Hmm.
is only going over there to go home and there's no confusion, you
Hmm.
also eliminate a lot of these other things that are really exasperated by beekeeping practices, but wouldn't happen in nature, because there would be a bee in this tree
Much more space.
and then the next one may be way down the block, kind of thing. They're not typically all right there. But again, to everything in beekeeping, like that whole presentation, I've got that whole presentation on the contradictions of beekeeping.
Yes.
um that, there's contradictions to that too. I have gone to a house and done 6 removals out of one house over the course of 3 days, because there were bees in like every corner of the house, but the house was the only thing out there for them to move
Well, that's
into.
what I was going to say. Is that and the fact that they smell like a colony as
Yep.
well, and then some colonies actually get desperate enough that they will go and move into whatever they can find,
Yeah.
and it might not
The
always
next
be the
best
best
thing.
part.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might not always be the best choice, but they'll do it anyway.
That's right. Do you have any other parting thoughts on this one? We could actually, for Bee-Centric, we could probably go on forever, but for sake of everybody's time, we will not do that.
We can always come up with a follow-up of this topic if we get questions. I
That's
mean,
true.
we always want to get the questions that you may have regarding all these topics that we talk about, and some of them will trigger a new episode where you're going to get more information, so don't hesitate to send those
Yeah.
questions.
At the very least, it's something that we can touch on, and we can do it here so that everybody can actually learn and share in that experience. Sometimes it may turn into a whole other thing. Who knows?
That's
But
right.
yeah, definitely don't hesitate to do that. So you can reach us in many different ways. So obviously the Hive Jive itself, you can do info@thehivejive.com. You can message us on Facebook or I was going to say infogram. Oh my God.
Ooh.
Facebook or Instagram at the Hive Jive. And then you can also reach out to Natalie at Be Mindful, and I will let you give the specifics on those there.
So you can reach us directly on the website through the contact form at be-mindful.com, or you can email me directly, email Les and I directly at bemindfulhoneyfarms@gmail.com. And then for those of you who want the contact information, if you want to text us and ask us questions, is there, but I'm not going to give it on the podcast.
That's always something that has always like cracked me up. Um, I'm not even going to say it because I don't want to open that door, but yeah, the my phone number is out there and has been very easy to find, but it baffled me like that well, it's not necessarily, well, let me change that. It's not necessarily that people couldn't find it or wasn't finding it, but they were being respectful enough not to just
Right.
unprovoked, like send or call or text or do anything like that to it. So that
Yeah.
was pretty cool. But unfortunately for all of you out there, that number's changing.
Oh, so well, you're giving me your new number, I hope.
Oh yeah, sure. Wink, wink. No.
Wait, wait. You better. I'll come and find you in Arkansas.
Well, if that's what it's gonna take, then no, I'm not gonna give you the
Oh
new number.
no.
You're
Well, I
gonna
told
have
you,
to you're gonna have to
Les and
come up
I
there.
will come by with
Yeah,
Les's wife, Erin, and we'll come and visit and crash the party.
heck yeah. But anyhow, we'll before I digress off onto something else. Thank you all for tuning in for another little beekeeper chat with Natalie and I. And hopefully this bee-centric conversation has given you some things to think about in your own beekeeping practices. And even if it's just slight, minute little changes that you might want to implement and see how they do, or maybe just paying more attention to the colony and trying to lead, let them lead by example and you follow that example. Any of these types of things, even the smallest little adjustments can actually have big beneficial
Mhm.
impacts on your beekeeping. So definitely try them out. If you have questions, rewind this and get that information on where you can send those questions to, shoot it over. We'll be more than happy to talk about it and do anything like that. We also do have the ability, this is off of Patreon itself, but we do have the ability of doing live broadcasts still, where we can have everybody call in and listen and do questions that way. And for those of you here on Patreon, you know what? It's not exactly beyond the realm of possibility that we could also do a live Zoom with all of you as well.
Ooh, that
and
would be
let
nice.
you log in and physically talk to us and see us instead of just hearing the audio version of it. And we can do a chat that way as well. And just one last little side note on there too. You guys have heard this many, many times, but Natalie and Les do the chat with a mindful beekeeper on Thursdays, and you can find that on their social media, and you can see them and you can type messages to them and they go through and they talk about those different questions that come up. So that's always a very interesting way to learn, mainly because you never know what individual is going to ask something. And it may be something you've always been curious about, or something you would have never thought about, but ends up being very good information. So questions are always welcome regardless.
And you can watch some of our previous recordings on Instagram at Be Mindful Honey Farms. And then you can get a link to the Zoom if you prefer to join us on Zoom.
So Zoom. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you so much for tuning in. I don't even know what I actually said there. It didn't sound right. Yeah, at that note, I think I need to go take a nap or go to bed or something. So everybody be good.
Be mindful, be bee-centric.
Be. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye, John.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.